Thank you, Bryce, and thank you, McKinsey, for being part of the Georgia Dairy Smart Roadmap. I said to Bryce, I feel like I am moving up in the world, because normally when I'm giving a talk and it's for credits, I either end up before dinner, before beverages, or before everybody going home. And this time there's at least one other speaker after me, so I don't feel like you're all forced to stay here to watch this presentation. So just real quickly, Nutrient is a company, and it's an LLC that was funded by dairy cooperatives a little over 10 years ago to help address the environmental issues on farm and make it economically viable to do so. So we've been around, we've got support not just from the dairy cooperatives, but a little bit of support from the checkoff part of the industry. They pay for us to keep a catalog of technologies, services, additives. We're going to talk a little bit about that later. And then we work with dairy farms all over the United States to try to figure out how can we help you, and what are the things that we can actually do that will improve your life on farm, the environment, and how can we get those paid for? And so that concept of figuring that out is what led to us creating the Georgia Smart Roadmap. And we're really looking at the different dairies in Georgia, breaking them up, looking for practices that fit for the different dairies, and every dairy is unique. I mean, you hear people say things like that all the time, but I've been on enough dairies to know that that doesn't mean that everyone needs a completely unique solution, but the guy whose barn is here and his manure pit is 6 miles away, uphill, has a whole different picture than the guy whose barn is here, and who, if he kicked the tire, it would roll for 4 miles to his lagoon next to the river in another state. So we need to take a look at generalizing what are the things that people can do on dairies in regions, and then individually what people can do on theirs, and put that in a way that story can be told, and that then we can go and get some funding for it. And the goal is the improved environmental income, or the environmental outcome and income for the dairy. So there's a lot of people that ask us to do things to help address environmental issues, but they don't want to be part of paying to get that done. And sorry, as good-hearted as the dairy industry is as a whole, nobody has the money to do it on their own. And so when I talk to people, I encourage them to work with your co-ops and work with the companies that can help you monetize these, and don't just say, I'll sell you milk that has a lower carbon footprint, because we all kind of know the direction that goes is once that starts, everybody's in another race for the bottom. So it's just going to add to your costs, and nobody's going to, eventually, they'll take that incremental cost away. So sell it as a separate product, sell it as a credit, do those sort of things. So one of the things that we looked at for Georgia were some of the things that drive the need for change on dairies: rising regulatory pressures, heat stress risk, high fertilizer and feed costs. I mean, particularly a couple of years ago when they first started fighting over the Ukraine again, we really saw what could happen to fertilizer prices here in the US. I had people calling me, asking me, Mark, my neighbors want to buy my manure for the first time in my life. How much should I charge them? Because nobody really had that number. And we can figure that out, but there are opportunities, and people start to see those opportunities once they really start getting into situations, and then there's not a lot of sometimes data ready hand, and that's where Nutrient can come in handy. Our website, nutrient.com, is a place where you can get phone numbers and data, and then you can reach out to us, and we're there And it doesn't cost you anything as a dairy producer in the United States unless you're specifically asking us to come and look at something specific to your farm. So yeah, helping you site a pump on your farm, probably you'd have to pay for that trip because it's not going to help anybody else deciding where to put a tank or a pump. But coming out and looking at an idea you have for a project and how to structure it, that might be applicable to many other dairymen. So that is what Nutrient does by and large. And so we have that opportunity to do that. The other thing is we do have some demand from our customers that some of these changes take place. And we're starting to get some interest from those same customers in helping pay for it. Some of them want to help pay for the technology. Some of them just want to buy the credits. Others want to find creative ways that they can work with us to do it. So that's what we have to do, is try to put this all together. So there are 74 dairies statewide at the time we did this study, plus or minus at this point. There's 3 major regions: the Coastal Plain, the Blue Ridge, Ridge and Valley, and Piedmont. And so we took 10 farms, and like Bryce was saying, how do you want me to introduce you? And I said, well, do whatever you like, but you can just tell people that I spent about a year ago wandering around dairies, and this is the report that I have to give. So, but we were here for about a week looking at those 10 farms. We had 4 smaller farms, less than 250 cows. We had 2 farms that were kind of in the middle, 250 to 700, and then 4 larger farms, over 700 cows. And the total herds that we looked at were almost 13,000 cows, and the total acres was about 7,800. And so what we tried to do on each of these farms was identify what was the thing that fit. Where were their pain points? What were the problems that they could use help getting? And then what could we improve that would make a difference for them? Because just adding more work was not our goal at all. And then to start to get clear on where to start and how you could do things to get to a final destination, and then maybe how we could look at support and funding for getting that start. And truly, the roadmap is a way of doing that. For your farm, if we do it on an individual farm basis, you get an individualized roadmap. If we didn't visit your farm, as a dairy producer in Florida, in one of these regions, in one of the sizes of dairies, you can at least look at a general roadmap, and then you can apply that to your farm and say, hey, these pieces will work. Now, how many people have seen this diagram before? Okay, there's 3 people with their hands up. So I'm going to explain it a little bit. And I'm going to challenge you because some of the people that raised their hand don't realize that this is the one that came out last fall. So the numbers are different. They just did an LCA, and this is based on the new LCA that was done in 2025. And it's trying to quantify where do the greenhouse gases in a dairy operation come from. And this is the nationwide percentage, okay? We kind of have it over there, and you can see that there's a difference in different regions. Because, what this dairy represents is a little bit of dry lot and a little bit of organic and a little bit of conventional and a little bit of no-till and a little bit of, rotary barns and flat barns and freestyle barns and, this is the national number. So if I did this on almost any dairy, you wouldn't come up with exactly those numbers because you're not, somebody who has a lot of heifers, or you're not somebody who only milks Jersey, or you're not somebody who has a loafing pen off the side of their barn, right? It's individualized. But about 42% of the greenhouse gas emissions that we can quantify now are coming from the feed and feeding operations. And you have to think of that almost from the snow or the winter is over, and as soon as you put a vehicle on that you're starting the number on your feed. So it's applying fertilizer, it's applying seed, it's the carbon footprint of the seed that you buy that comes in. How many people here, and this ends up being a little bit too wonky, but how many people here are familiar with Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions? Have at least heard those terms, right? Okay. Scope 1 is what you do on your farm. Your cow belches, methane goes in the air, Scope 1. Scope 2 is the electricity you buy. This 5%. The diesel you buy. The trucking diesel that moves the stuff back and forth from your farm to the processing plant is a Scope 2 emission to the processing plant. And Scope 3 emissions are those emissions that come with product that comes into your plant. So the seed you buy and plant has emissions tied to it. Somebody did a lot of work to get that bag of seed onto your farm, and with that, every bag of seed has this imaginary carbon footprint it takes along with it. So all of that, up until the time you put it in the front of the cow, is in feed. So that's why feed includes your grinding, it includes your hauling, it includes your storage, it includes your mixers. All of that gets put into feed and feed production. The enteric emissions, the cows belching, is another 29%. And there's not an awful lot we can do about that right now. There are some feed additives and things like that. The higher value feed that you can produce, the more milk you can produce, the better you do on that number, because generally a cow standing around doing nothing and a cow making I shouldn't say doing nothing, but let's say somebody at the national average of 75 pounds, she does not emit that much less than her sister cow down at the other end of the freestall barn that's making 100 pounds. But that 25 pounds, dividing the carbon footprint over it, makes a big difference. And then finally, there's a 5% energy. Now, you might be saying, well, Mark, I don't know why you're even talking about this stuff, because we can only make so much milk. But the difference between the Southeast, and this is not just Georgia, this is the Southeast, and the national number is 100% plus explained by the production. Now, if you've taken any total quality management classes or any classes on troubleshooting and stuff like that, how do you find the root cause of a problem? Anybody know the rule of 5? I see a couple faces smiling out there. It's easy. You just ask why 5 times. And when you ask this question, why 5 times, like, why is our milk production lower? Well, we have heat stress. Well, why do we have heat stress? Well, we live in the South, stupid. Well, why do you live in the South? Well, okay. But you get my point. Increasing production and addressing those issues that are stressing your cows to get production up are going to make a big difference. And so when we get to the actual roadmap, you're going to see that there's things that you wouldn't really think about from a manure standpoint, that what we're really trying to do is take the number of carbon emissions that are on your farm and spread them over more milk. If you can do that, your carbon footprint goes down. So one of the easiest answers, and usually one of the ones that the dairymen like the most, is, what, I can go back to trying to figure out how to make more milk? And it's a good thing? Yes, it is. If we can get more milk out of every cow, it's a good thing. So we're going to look at statewide, look at the regions, kind of give you the overview. We're not going to show any of the individual farms. We are pretty particular about keeping your information when you work with nutrient behind the paywall, if you will. But we do put together these roadmaps that give a regional basis, and we use that, and we use the areas we go to kind of create those. So heat stress and productivity is a big challenge here in the Southeast. Limited solid separation, the solids in the manure break down, they become volatile fatty acids. The volatile fatty acids in the manure get taken up by methanogens, an older group of bacteria that just eat these volatile fatty acids and convert them into methane and carbon dioxide, and those two gases float to the top of your holding pond or your tanks or whatever you're putting them in where anaerobic conditions can, and they emit into the atmosphere. Manure storage is often insufficient for the timing to do it agronomically correct, so you end up putting out as much manure as you can on the fields as soon as you can in the spring, and then you get another chance later in the fall to get the pit empty before the bad weather comes, right? And so we all have nutrient management plans, and we all try to adhere to them and do everything at an agronomic rate, but perfectly, if your agronomist could have his druthers, you'd be adding those nutrients as the crops needed them throughout the time, and you wouldn't be adding those nutrients all in the spring and all at the end of the fall. But that's the nature of dairy farming. And so there are new technologies that are coming out, and there are new opportunities to improve that, but those are some of the things that we're looking at. And then what you don't measure, you can't fix. So testing your manure, testing your soils, knowing where you need things, very important. There are many low-cost, high-impact practices that get underused. Now, I say that, but at the same time, they're not always, they appear low cost initially, but they aren't necessarily low cost when you start looking at how the farm has to manage what they do. So, and then finally, the economics still remain the biggest barrier to getting this stuff done. I mean, we just don't have hundreds of thousands of dollars laying around to do solid liquid separation on our dairies. You know, it's not that we don't want to, it's not that we can't find a use for those dairies, for those solids and things like that, but it is one of the things that we have to be aware of is there's a cost and we have to find a way to pay for it. So statewide, now this is not by region, this is just by the state, the feed implications or the feed practices that we looked at and we saw the most often among all sizes of farms were precision nutrient management, really honing in with your nutritionist and getting that cow performing as high as you can. Cover crops, basically keeping roots in the ground so that you're not disturbing, you know, and this gets to the reducing tillage, so you're not disturbing the land, you're not releasing the nitrous oxide, and you're keeping something growing. And for you guys, unlike where I grew up in Minnesota or where I live now just outside of Chicago, you can actually sometimes get a second crop. Where when I left Northwest Indiana, it was 2 degrees. There ain't nothing growing. You know, my grass isn't growing. There's nothing growing. You stand out too long, you are not even growing. You're just going to stop. But here, you know, it's 50 degrees outside. Grass is still growing. You know, some of you are going to go a little farther south into Florida, and I know you don't have to cut your grass as much because you guys have warm weather grasses, but you might have to pull your lawnmower out before February. I won't. But so as we move over to production, and production, here's where we're gonna have to play a little bit of a linguistic game, right? Because I said production is the enteric emissions, but in reality, things like milk production offsetting the enteric emissions is related to production, and that's where cow cooling. And again, 122% of the difference between you and the national average is milk production. And again, you know, asking that why 5 times, why is your milk production down? Because I'm in Georgia, I'm in Florida. It's hot here. Cows, Dr. Gordy Jones, some of you may know, Gordy said that cows were the last remaining Pliocene megafauna, which just means they grew up in the Ice Age. And so their thermal neutral temperature is 43 degrees. That's like you in your house are comfortable at 72 when you're wearing clothes, typically. That is your thermal neutral temperature. For them, they're as comfortable at 43 as you are at 72. And so people who say, well, yeah, we don't have heat stress. We get in the 80s sometimes, but it doesn't really affect production too much. Yeah, you're not asking your cow's opinion, because she was starting to stress out at 60 degrees. And so cow cooling is something to really look at. Feed additives, precision feeding, like I know, because I've talked to the people on the farms, there are actually some of the guys in your region that change their feeding when it gets hot to reduce the stress on the cows so that they have opportunities. And then managed grazing for those farms that do any grazing, and making sure that that forage is really, really good, that they're getting off the, from the manure standpoint, getting some of the solids out, or getting as many of the solids out as you can, is definitely a positive. Managing your waste storage. You don't always have a choice in this because of the acreage and because of the depth, but a shallower, bigger pond that gets turned over by wind and stuff like that stays aerobic more and has less methane generation than a super deep pond that doesn't get any air movement and doesn't get any turnover. And generally, you'll see a little lower carbon footprint from somebody who's got a bigger, and then having that comprehensive nutrient management plan and knowing what you're making and where it has to go and those sort of things. And then some of the last things on the energy side, just energy efficiency, hot water heat recovery. I know it sounds crazy because we just talked about, it's always hot here, but it's not hot enough to get your water hot. And if you're spending money to heat your water and you've got a compressor there that you're running 5 fans to cool down, heat your water first and then blow it with the fans, and you can recover some money. You don't have to pay to cool the milk as much. So that's some of those low-hanging fruit type programs that I think it's the Mueller brand that makes they call it a free heater, not preheater, free heater with an F, to go in front of your regular water heater and just gather up some of that heat, preheat your water. It's free, and you don't have to run the fans as much to cool your milk. And then finally, again, for the guys that are doing grazing, the guys that do have animals out on pasture, solar shades or solar panels, where you're getting some renewable energy, but also getting those cows someplace where they can get out of the heat and reduce that stress on them, that can be valuable. So I'm going to pick up a little bit here, because this is then when we're going to start looking at the large farms. And this is essentially what Nutrient provides. This type of, the next 2 or 3 slides, the next 3 slides are what end up in the one page of the report that kind of give you the roadmap, if you will, not necessarily the order it should be in, but what are the practices in each of the different areas. And for example, on large farms, again, statewide, this isn't broken up by region yet, you have integrated manure application and wastewater pivots. Pivots where you got a nice flat field, but like if you're from certain parts of the state, there isn't 60 acres that's flat anywhere on your farm. There are some new technologies called like the Rain 360, computer controlled, I'm trying to think, irrigators, not pivots, but computer controlled, goes out, lays down the water, comes back, runs the same route. You can actually do some very precise nutrient addition with those, and you can get some really interesting things happening with those if you've got a field that you need to irrigate and that doesn't lend itself to a center pivot. And then one of the ones that's really interesting is a lot of guys do have pivots, and when we did our first roadmap, we did it in the northern part of Florida, and they were looking for some low-hanging fruit, and the low-hanging fruit was helping guys stick some extra pipe in so they could get their manure to a few more pivots. And it's surprising that that's a really reasonable cost. And for the farm, it's not a huge thing. Is if you get a valve and now you can go to 2 pivots and put manure water on instead of 1, it can actually be, a pretty reasonable investment. And the water districts in Florida was very happy because that's something they could literally see, well, until the pipe was in the ground, that they were making a difference. We now have the opportunity to spread it over this many acres, and we were doing it over this many acres. So there's some opportunities like that that are really pretty good. And then, of course, you're going to see this on every single size farm. Not going to try to overdo it, but adding and increasing milk cow cooling. I would also add dry cow cooling and springers just before once they're starting to get stressed and once they become an adult cow and they're carrying a calf, there is value to adding cooling. You're seeing some of this as we see different dairies make changes, is adding freestall barns and getting cows in where they're controlling the temperature, they're controlling the airflow. There's several vendors here. I saw lots of fans out in the exhibit hall. That's because if you start getting them in that enclosed space, you get them under shade, and you start moving that air at about 7 miles an hour, life gets a lot better. Even if it's not 43 degrees, it's a lot better if you're a cow than standing out there in the sunshine when it's 80. So, and then some farms see an advantage to converting from straw or organic material to something like manure solids, where they take the solids out and then it has a use to be the bedding that they use. Now, if you're bedding on sand, and the sand's not costing you too much, there's a real question about whether or not, I've seen farms that have somatic cell counts of low hundreds on manure solids. It can be done. But if your cows are being bedded on sand right now, it probably can't be done by you without at least a 3-year transition period, because you have desert cows and you're going to change them into jungle cows, and a bunch of them are going to get sick. So that's one that you really have to understand your herd, you have to understand your economics. If you're already using organic bedding, if you already just top dressing, say, water mattresses, and then there's an opportunity to pull solids out that they can't convert into gas and then also reduce your bedding costs, it's something to consider. That one's a little bit more nuanced than just, oh yeah, run out there and everything will be fine. Probably not. Bedding gives you, sand bedding gives you a little more leeway when it comes to management than the manure solids do. You've got to be careful when you're making those transitions. So, touching again on some we've already done, coarse solid separators. Coarse solid separators remove the coarse solids that don't really convert to methane as much, but they do bring along a lot of other solids that do convert to methane. And then the other part of coarse solid separation is once you get the coarse solids out, there's more you can do with the fine solids. You're more able, once you get the coarse solids out, to do irrigation, to do precision irrigation, to maybe do other types of treatment. Concrete surfaces, this is just almost more of a less greenhouse gas and more of a managing the runoff and the solids that you do put on the farm. It's not enough to just get the solids out. You have to manage those solids and figure out what you're going to do with them. And a static pile is fine, but do it someplace where if it rains, what comes off that static pile is going to find its way into your, holding pond or something like that. Don't let it run off into your, nearest creek. That's a bad idea. And then sand separation, if you are using sand, reusing the sand, if it's coarse enough that you can get it out, or at least getting it out of your waste stream before it fills up your holding pond, it's a good idea. Again, Larger farms tend to be the ones that struggle a little bit more with having a big enough storage pit. So then they're the ones that end up having to do a little bit of, oh, we cut hay, we can put some nutrients on that hay now. You know, we got to find some way to get that liquid out of those holding ponds. And then one of the things that you can do, and this is one where you can actually generate some carbon credits, is actually covering the holding ponds. I was talking with somebody today about covering a final holding pond, and one of the questions was, well, what if solids get in there? And there's actually technologies now where you can put in a structure at the side of the holding pond where they can send robotic dredges up underneath the covers and they can clean out your holding pond. Now, you may want to configure that holding pond a little different than just a big flat surface where everything is spread out. If you put a little bit of a dip down on the end where the material comes in, where it starts to settle and you can go get it easier, it might make cleaning that a little bit easier to do and a little more effective than trying to clean the entire surface. But there are opportunities to generate carbon credits on smaller farms just from flaring that. There's a company called Frost Methane that does that. And then if you're a bigger farm and in this area, here's where you finally get the good news of being in the Southeast. You actually have warm enough temperatures that becomes a digester. Really the only difference between covering a holding pond and creating a covered lagoon digester is whether you put an energy generating system on the end of it. Cover and flare, they typically don't balloon up, the gas just goes out at whatever rate and the flare burns it off. If you could take that same material and send it to a gas upgrader, you could put it in the pipeline. It's renewable natural gas. And then we're going to go through the same thing for medium farms. And there's not that much difference in these overall statewide applications. Transfer piping, cover crops, milk cow cooling, freestall barns, solid separation. Sometimes we see in this that you need a little bit more infrastructure, so you might need another pit or a bigger transfer pump or things like that. But even in those technologies, like there's an LSM makes a pump that's a peristaltic pump. You all know what they look like because they're the little itty bitty pumps that are pumping the chemical into your CIP system. Well, if you take that same thing on steroids and make it about this big, it can pump manure, sand-laden manure up to a mile. So there's pumps and pieces of equipment that can do a lot of this stuff and presents a pretty good opportunity for all of you. And I think small farms, you're going to see a little bit, more on the small farm, cow cooling, managed grazing, adding waterers. It's surprising to me when I walk on a farm, and nobody in this room has ever done this that I know of. If you did, I apologize. But when I walk out and I look out on a dry lot or an open lot, and I see 4 or 5 waterers with 20 cows around each one, and I say, you ever think about adding waterers? And the farmer says, oh no, we've got 2 feet per cow. Or whatever number they use, right? I got enough. I looked it up in a book. Well, go look at your dry lot. There, your cows are sitting there. Not everybody's waiting for a turn at the waterer, right? A great place to put a waterer is right outside your holding pen. When they get coming out of the barn, give them a way to get a drink on their way back. And you'll find out a lot of cows stop and drink right after they've been milked. It's not going to work in the holding pen, but in that loafing lane up beside the holding pen, there's an opportunity. But water is something that I don't think gets enough attention sometimes. Again, shades. A lot of the smaller farms don't always have the nutrient management plan or a comprehensive nutrient management plan. You might say, well, I don't need it. Well, you do need it if you want to work with NRCS to get equip money and things like that. So getting some of those plans done and having some of that so that you can come into the NRCS office and sit down and say, here's my nutrient management plan, here's my roadmap, here's the project I'd like to do. And all of a sudden, now you've got an advocate. Now you've got somebody you can work with. Whereas if you go in and say, hey, I heard this guy talk about some program about equipment, and you can give me 75% of the install, and I want some of that. Well, you're a long ways from a viable project at that point. You know, they'll do what they can to educate you, but the more you can prepare and show them that you've invested time and effort and you have an understanding of what you're looking to do, the better opportunity you're going to have. And particularly in the smaller farms, but I think depending on, there's programs that you can get into large farms, and you get around the adjusted gross income, but there are opportunities to certainly get funding from USDA through NRCS to make some of these changes. And some of them can be pretty basic changes, like helping you get better roads, helping you, put down a concrete pad for managing the solids, those sort of things. So there's about 57 in the nutrient handbook that are specifically tied to dairy. They're called practices. So if you go to our catalog and down the left-hand side, you click on practices, it'll pull up the dairy specific conservation practice standards that you might be interested in. Now, there's hundreds of them if you go to the USDA site, but not all of them are applicable to dairy. So that's why we tried to generate it. And then we tried to put links there that was, I kid one of the guys that I work with, Jeff Porter, because he used to be the manure manager for the entire country. And I said, I have a theory that USDA actually hires people to make their website as complex as possible so you can't find anything. And is that true? And he laughs and says, no, it just seems that way. But so looking at the results, what are we trying to do? We're trying to improve your manure systems, help you use nutrients more efficiently, maybe reducing your fertilizer costs, improve your cow comfort. Comfortable cows are more productive cows, get you healthier, better managed soils, and then improve energy usage and heat recovery. All of those things should have an economic impact on your dairy in a positive direction. Now, whether it'll be enough to afford something like a solar project or something like that, that's something you and your accounting people will have to figure out. But there's opportunities there for certain farms. The roadmap tries to look at things that are going to reduce your inputs, fertilizer, bedding, labor, increase your milk production, lower transport and handling costs, particularly of the manure, improve that nutrient efficiency, use efficiency, offset costs either through NRCS or other carbon credit programs, sometimes putting those together where NRCS pays for 75% on the front end and maybe one of your co-op's customers pays for the credits on 25% on the back end in a contract, so that at the end of the install you own the system outright and you have all your costs covered. We've done a couple of RCPP projects or other projects with things like that. Save you energy, increase your crop yield. And the one that I think is really important that you understand, and the reason that we don't just say go to our catalog and do whatever you want to, is we try to look at ongoing improvements that could build on each other. So I've been at places where somebody says, well, someday I want a digester, but I can't afford to build one right now, so I don't think this program's really for me. And I'm like, well, how would you like to start by getting some credits for coarse solid separation? He's like, yeah, but then I won't be able to put in a digester. And I said, sure you can. Just put a valve in front of the coarse solid separation so that when the time comes, you can put the digester there. And then after the digester, use the coarse solid separation. I mean, these things can be designed that way so that one thing can feed into the next thing. I want to cover my lagoon and flare the gas. I don't want to put that gas out there anymore. Okay, do you have a coarse solid separator? Oh, no. Well, 2 years from now, you're going to have to take that cover off unless you get the solids out before it goes in there. So we try to look at the roadmap so that there's actually a path to get you there without you wasting any money on, on projects. So there's federal programs, conservation stewardship programs, EQIP. You notice there's no U, EQIP. Georgia Natural Resource Conservation Service, state and local grants and things like that we've been working with. Here's where Bryce and McKinsey can help you when you get down into the individual state and local and utility level things. They're going to be much better at answering those questions. We talked about carbon, and we talked about the value and the role of carbon insets. And I don't want to, I can totally geek out and go for way too long, but the short version of insets is, if I produce a carbon credit and I sell it to Microsoft, Microsoft gets to say their carbon footprint went down, and I can't, because I sold it. If I take that same credit and I sell it to somebody who's making cheese from the milk I produce, the cheese producer and I can both claim our carbon credit, our carbon footprint went down. That's insetting. And so as an industry, as we look for those opportunities, I'll give you an example of a company or an industry that did a great job of insetting, and that's the landfill industry. How many people realize that RNG engines almost completely dominate trash trucks? Irritates a lot of people because they're really quiet, and people depend on hearing that diesel engine to get up and get their trash out to the road. But they produce the gas, clean the gas, put it in their own trucks, and become their own best customer. And oh, by the way, because it's a transportation fuel related, they get the RFS RINs for everything they produce. And they're all D3 RINs if it comes out of a landfill. So that's insetting. Next steps, from where do we go from here with this program and others, is maybe to identify more funding. The very first roadmap that we did for the water district up in the northern part of Florida. And that roadmap has been used for the last 3 years by the United Dairy Farmers of Florida to work with the water district and with the soils district and with their Department of Agriculture and with their agricultural committee in the House and the Senate down there to bring, the number I heard last was $20 million is what they're expecting to come out of all of that work. But having those documents and having that ability to show this is what we're doing and this is how we're doing it was instrumental in them getting a seat at the table and getting an opportunity to ask and try to develop that funding. So these are the things that we're trying to do. We want to capture opportunities. You know, it would be really great to sit here and have 2 or 3 of you on a panel with me talking about the projects you had put in and how it has affected your farm and whether or not it has been beneficial. That would be a neat panel to have sometime, Bryce, is find those guys that are doing stuff and sit them up here and give them their credit for being there for an hour. And then we want to look to expand roadmaps, maybe in more southeast states, maybe in more areas, more milk sheds, things like that. So there's opportunities there. Nutrient, I mentioned a couple of times, don't have a lot of time and don't want to go over and stomp on another presentation, but we do have a catalog. Right now there's over 500 different technologies, practices, services, additives, all listed in there. That 9-point scale, once you kind of learn to read it, you know, the first one, is it on more than 3 dairies? Is it on, you know, does it have over a year on more than 3 dairies? Is it on 10 dairies? One of them is, the last one is, can you get government funding for it? You know, once you can learn that scale, you can pretty quickly look at something and go, oh, I'm not really interested in that. Or a couple of the other ones are like capital cost, operating cost. I'm not going to try to go into them all. This is, when you go there, this is what I was talking about. We've got additives, practices, services. You can pick just practices over here on this sector side, and then what shows up here will not be digesters or screw presses or anything else. Or you can say, I just want aeration equipment, or I just want feed additives. And you can go and look for it. Again, you'll get a pop-up at the beginning that says, hey, what's your name? What's your email address? Do you agree to not sue Nutrient because you used their catalog and something didn't work for you. And then after that, you'll just get you're on the newsletter. We get this used by a lot of different people. We do try to do a job of kind of recognizing the people that are there, maybe the new stuff that's coming out. If you see this symbol, it doesn't mean that the technology is bad. It looks like we kind of made it kind of a cold, prickly symbol, but it just means that we're working to make sure all the information's right. So we work with the vendors. We don't make any money from them, but we work with them to try to make sure we keep the information current and that we get the information right that we put out. And this is what a page looks like when you went from that first page. See if I can do this. When you click on the first page, this one, when you click there, you pull up this page. And it basically gives you a description of the company, a picture, because it's nice to have pictures. This is a description of the technology. And then we have the 9-point scoring system. We have reviews. We have all the information for reaching out to the company. We have links to documents and additional documents, and some of them go in great detail that an engineer could look at it and go, oh, I see this needs 3-phase power, or I see how many feet this needs. So we also, on the same website, in the resources page, we have vendor snapshots that talk a little bit more about technologies. We do in-depth evaluations. When we do a study, a comprehensive report, we study a technology for 15 weeks and we sample 3 times a week. So we have 45 data points that we can start looking at. And it really helps to quantify, well, yeah, we had that bad week, but we found the pump went bad. Well, then we throw out those 3 data points and we still have good, statistically significant data. These are just the QR codes for getting to the different places, the blog, the resource library, and the solution catalog. So I don't see a lot of people holding up their cameras, so we'll move on from that. And then these are all of our newsletter, contact form, LinkedIn, YouTube videos, and the Nutrient team. I should have offered to take questions while we were doing this. I didn't. There's really not a question and answer period, but I'll be around for the rest of the conference, at least till noon, and happy to answer any questions that you have, or happy to contact me. Again, that's my email address. You're more than welcome to email or call anytime.